Hey guys, Dr. Kerr here, and I want to talk about something I'm seeing more and more of in the office. It's not just that people are fatigued, it's that they also have this bubble gut. So they have this gas, they have this bloating, they have this yuck within their belly. Um, that if it wasn't bad enough just to have the fatigue that's interfering with their work and their parenting and their home life, now you have this like food baby in this kind of, yeah, what I call the bubble gut that doesn't make you want to be active. It doesn't make you want to do anything except sit around. So the problem is, I guess the solution is actually they're both connected. It's not necessarily a digestive issue. It's not necessarily a hormone issue, but what I would say it's an energy issue. And you're probably like, well, no, duh. Like that's not rocket science. But when I say energy, I don't want you to think of just how alert or how fatigued you are, but I want you to think of energy as currency. And the currency in the body is this thing called ATP. And well, you should have anyway, have learned about this back in high school biology. And so a lot of your health issues, if you go back to biology and physiology, can easily be solved and easily be understood, opposed to being thrown a diagnosis and being treated with something. And so when you're thinking about energy and currency, this is kind of the hierarchy within the body. Like you may think you're tired and fatigued because of a thyroid issue. I could argue disruption in this happens well before a thyroid issue surfaces, or an adrenal issue, or depression, or anxiety, any of those types of things. So in order to understand fatigue and bubble gut, we have to understand ATP. So we're going to get a little bit nerdy. I'm going to dive into this just a little bit, but hopefully it makes sense why at the end, the bubble gut and the fatigue are closely related, and you don't have to keep restricting your diet more and more and more and being afraid to eat, that you can get some energy back, you can get digestion back, kind of by doing very similar things to support both of them. So how do we make energy? How do we make this ATP? Well, it all starts with one molecule of glucose. So yeah, like we're talking about sugar, and I know sugar has been villainized, but the body's very capable of using it. The problem is we're just overdosing on it, and we're doing it in a situation that's not very effective, not very conducive to process that very efficiently. And I'll get to that more. But anyway, you got one molecule of glucose. It's got to be broken down. And this is what we call glycolysis. You need energy to make energy. It's like you need money to make money in a business. And so you're going to spend 2 units of ATP breaking down that sugar into 2 molecules of what we call, or what they call, pyruvate. I didn't make any of these things up. But the cool thing is you get a return of 4 ATP. So you get a net of 2. So you use 2, you gain 4, and you have this profit, so to speak, of 2 ATP. So you're on the positive side and you're making energy. Now, you want to make more energy, and we have an awesome system with like a super nutrient that can create this into 38 ATP. And that's what we call aerobic respiration. So oxygen is going to be the spark that fuels a lot more energy efficient production within your body. And so on the right hand side of this, that initial glucose goes through these 3 cycles, so glycolysis, Krebs, electron transport chain, to eventually produce 38 ATP. So 1 glucose, 2 ATP to produce 38. That's a pretty good return on investment. And that's going to sustain you for a lifetime. But not all life is calm and chill and deep and relaxing breathing. We have a lot of moments that throw us more into survival, more into protection. That's going to warrant respiration or energy production without the use of oxygen, or very little use of oxygen. And so we call this anaerobic. And so there's 2 main cycles with this one. The first one's glycolysis, just like the first. You got to break down the sugar, but then this feeds into a cycle called fermentation. And you're familiar with fermentation if you've ever drinking alcohol, because here's a sugar, you feed it to a yeast, and then we produce bubbles. Well, this is no different than happen in your body, except the yeast you're feeding or the bacteria you're feeding is within your gut. So if you're in a high stress, high demand environment, deficiencies, all these types of things that have shifted you into a protective mechanism, physical, chemical, emotional, social, kind of what life is throwing at high achievers, you're probably more apt to be in this anaerobic environment. And what's going to happen is the bacteria in your gut are going to shift to the ones that don't like oxygen because there's not that much available. So when you eat a carb, when you eat some sugar, there's potential for that carb to then be fermented into carbon dioxide. And then boom, you have this big, whatever, food baby. You look like you're 6 months pregnant by 10 o'clock in the morning after eating your standard American breakfast. And so this is one of those aspects where most people, at least coming to me, have like restricted so much food or restricted so much of what they can eat. And now they're at a point like they're afraid to eat because they just don't want that, whatever, that bubble within their belly. And so a lot of times, I don't know, like they'll get labeled with IBS or IBD or things like that. But when we're looking at some more functional tests, in this case, this is organic acids, you can see markers of bacterial overgrowth. And it's between this and like stool testing, you can come up with a lot of information regarding like what's happening in that microbiome that may be utilizing what you're eating and fermenting it, opposed to like digesting it well enough. And at the bottom there, you're going to see lactate. So think lactic acid, because that's the next way of disrupting energy as well as producing bubble gut. So this is what we're looking at, the metabolic side. So if we're going to ferment carbs, if you're going to burn sugar as fuel, it's going to be broken down into lactate and lactic acid. And you're going to be familiar with this because of muscles. If you've ever like worked out hard, ran, sprinted, you get that burn, that tiredness, those types of things. You can't keep up this very long. And the body doesn't want lactic acid building up, because that's bad news. Like that's like emergency type situations. So what ends up happening is the body will then try to recycle lactate. So here's where we're getting a little bit nerdy, between your muscles and your liver. So you took glucose, you took sugar, convert it to pyruvate, and you gain 2 ATP. So you got some energy. Pyruvate will then get fermented into lactic acid, so on this bottom part of the cycle, and dump it into the bloodstream. Here, you don't want a lot of it, because again, like that could be an emergency situation when lactic acidosis goes super high. So the liver's like, great, I'm going to recycle it back into the liver, convert it back to pyruvate, back to glucose. And this whole cycle is awesome. It saves your life. But what ends up happening is you have to use 6 ATP when you only produce 2. So at some point you're in a deficit over and over and over and over and over again. So this is where the fatigue starts happening massively. And again, looking at some testing, you can see in this person anyway, lactate super high. So they're spilling a lot of this. And then pyruvate's under detectable limit, so it's not converting back to it. So this person probably has liver issues, insulin resistance, super anaerobic situation, in which until you do like real functional testing, it's not going to be evident for that. And so that's why I call this kind of the human hamster wheel, because most are taking what they're producing for energy and throwing it into a environment without much oxygen, which then creates fermentation, which then feeds the bacteria that don't like oxygen. They produce carbon dioxide, boom, bubble gut. Or what you're going to do is you're going to ferment this into lactic acid, and that whole trying to save your life of producing too much and recycling it, that's actually using up more energy than doing what your normal daily kind of exposures are. So how you break this cycle, and this is going to be a canned answer, is like, don't guess, test. Because yes, you may have bubble gut, you may have digestive issues, you may have fatigue, and it's really easy for people to get a label like you have a thyroid issue, you have IBD, you have IBS, whatever it is. That doesn't tell you why it's happening or what's going on. It just tells you what's currently happening. And it's kind of like I'm a huge Office fan, so when Dwight and Jim are in charge of birthdays and they just put up the sign for Kelly Kapoor, it is your birthday. Like that's about as effective as your diagnosis. It is your diagnosis. It is your condition. It is your birthday. It doesn't tell you anything why or how to attack it. And so the testing that would be great in kind of these situations, one is organic acids. That's looking at more the metabolic side of fermentation, though there are some bacterial overgrowth markers there. And then the GI map is another favorite of mine that looks at more the microbiome version of fermentation by looking at the ecosystem of the gut. Most people want some quick wins, and reverse this pretty quickly. So another way to break the cycle, this is where HBOT comes into play, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, where you are not intaking enough oxygen, so you need to saturate the system very quickly. And so what happens of oxygen within pressure is that oxygen now dissolves directly into your tissues, independent of your red blood cells having to carry it around. So you're getting a lot more saturation a lot quicker than you would just by doing breathing exercises and slowing down and all those fun things. So if you have questions, reach out. Feel free to book a discovery call. Put a link somewhere down below the video. But hopefully this makes sense why fatigue and bubble gut are going to be often connected, in that it's not two separate issues, but compounding symptoms of very similar dysfunctions going on. So I'll talk to you guys later.